Happy to have you here. My name is Jacob Myers. I am one of the doctoral fellows at the Wolf Humanities Center, and I am the moderator for our second panel today on the key word of humanity. So, like before, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers one at a time, and then they will come up and give us their papers. So today, we are going to start with Manu Chander. Manu Chander is Associate Professor of English at Georgetown University. He is the author of Brown Romantics, Poetry and Nationalism in the Global 19th Century, the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Romanticism and Race, and the co-editor with Tricia A. Matthew of the Oxford University Press book series, Race in 19th Century Literature and Culture. His scholarship has been supported by the Fulbright Scholars Program and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. Professor Chander is a founding member of the Bigger Six Collective, formed in 2017 to challenge structural racism in the academic study of Romanticism, and board chair of the Curationist Foundation, which brings together arts and culture communities to find, share, collaborate, and reimagine cultural narratives. So let's please welcome our first speaker.
I want to thank Jacob for inviting me to participate in this conversation, Pamela Horn for organizing the details of the visit, my co-panelists, Gabrielle Cornish and Stephen Weitzman, and of course all of you guys for coming out on a Friday. Strange, I guess, to start with the subtitle of my talk, but the subtitle of my talk is Humanity, Civility, Brownness, three terms I wish to place in dialogue. In medieval use, Williams writes in Raymond Williams, obviously, writes in keywords, humanity, quote, appears synonymous with courtesy and politeness and contained a strong sense of civility. And from the 16th century on, the sense of, I'm quoting again, the sense of courtesy and politeness is extended to kindness and generosity, end quote. The affinity between humanity and civility, I will suggest, is complicated by the third term here, brownness. Did that not work? What do I? Nope. What do I press? Oh yeah, that's great. Can I just cue you in the back? Oh, okay. Let's do it that way then. Oh, my flow. Hang on, because there's a thing. Okay. The affinity between humanity and civility, I will suggest, is complicated by the third term, brownness. But I want to begin by discussing a different affinity. In Stuart Hall's 1993 tribute to Raymond Williams' Culture, Community, Nation, the source of my talk's main title, Hall writes about his colleague and frequent interlocutor, quote, there was an elective affinity which made me feel close to Williams despite our enormous differences in temperament, character, background, ages, generation, and formation. Our responses as scholarship boys from the peripheries of English culture to our first encounter with the institutions which were at its very center as a dominant cultural system, Oxbridge. A shared sense of displacement and alienation from the dominant English culture of the educated metropolitan upper middle classes led both Hall and Williams to look elsewhere for a model of culture that would center that which was excluded by the Oxbridge elite. For Williams, this meant, in Hall's words, next slide, please. Oh, the next slide. Thank you. For Williams, finding that alternate model of culture meant, and this is Stuart Hall's summary of Raymond Williams' theory of culture, honoring those actual lived relationships of place, culture, and community, which did not figure in an exalted way in the hierarchy of conventionally valued English things, and sympathizing with the struggles and the peoples and culture of the peoples and cultures of Wales. So Williams would describe the opposition between his Wales and a Cambridge that would never fully be his in terms that recur throughout his work, including in the keywords for culture, civilization, and as I will discuss more fully later, humanity. Next slide, please. It was the supposed politeness of the Oxbridge set that Williams chafed against. Cambridge culture was, in Williams' words, coarse, pushing, name-ridden, loud, competitive, and deprived. No place for anyone fortunate enough to grow up in a home in a genuinely well-mannered and sensitive community. Williams opposes the dominant class's self-ascribed manners to the, quote, genuine manners of the sensitive community from which he came. Civility speak at Cambridge was at odds with the actual civility of the Welsh, who for Williams exemplified culture. A lot of this is coming from Williams's later work too, toward 2000 and some of the later writings where he more explicitly talks about Pandy, his home in Wales. Williams's understanding of culture is indebted, I think, to Johann Gottfried Herder, whose use of the term Williams describes as a decisive innovation, whose use of the term culture. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, we're past that. Oh yeah, nah. Yes. No, back, I think. Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot, Nathan. Williams' understanding of culture is indebted to Herder, whose use of the word culture Williams describes as a decisive innovation. Williams suggests in the keyword entry for culture that it was Herder who first rejected the association between culture and civilization. If for Enlightenment thinkers, Kultur suggested a general process of becoming civilized or cultivated, for Romantics such as Herder, it was, quote, used to attack what was seen as the mechanical character of the new civilization then emerging, both for its abstract rationalism and for the inhumanity of current industrial development. The inhumanity that Herder rejects is necessary to understanding how Williams conceives of humanity, and for us to consider the promises and problems with this conception. Next slide. In a representative moment in his ideas for the philosophy of the history of mankind, Herder writes, quote, "The savage who in his narrower circle thinks for himself and expresses himself more truthfully, definitely, and emphatically, who within the bounds of his actual existence," and actual existence is a very Williams-esque kind of phrase there, right? Is capable of employing his senses and limbs, his practical understanding, and his few implements with the skill and presence of mind. He is, man for man, more civilized, gebildete, than the polite, politische, or learned, gelernte automaton, who like a child stands elevated on a lofty platform built, alas, by the hands of others, or indeed the labors of an entire preceding age. Herder puts a distinctively romantic spin on Rousseau's noble savage here, attacking what Williams calls the mechanical character of civilization by labeling the modern European a polite automaton, politische Maschine, who lacks the culture of the civilized, gebildete savage, wilde. I'm not just throwing in the German words to sound erudite or anything. I'm going to talk about why they matter in a few minutes. You could chuckle, that was like a half joke. It's like a joke that just didn't land. Because literally I was doing my German Duolingo like, on the train up this morning. Actually, so it's not just that Herder offered culture, as William put it, as an alternative to the orthodox and dominant civilization. Rather, in a move Williams would later adopt, he mobilized the civility of the savage against the civility of the polite and learned European, who was decidedly uncivilized. This was a rhetorical strategy, of course, just as it was for Williams when he opposed Oxbridge manners to the genuine manners he associated with home. But that strategy is, I would suggest, revealing. What the savage had that the European lacked was Gebildetheit, which, with its suggestion of building, development, and growth, is properly the domain of the human. Where the inhuman automaton passively receives manners and knowledge, the gebildete Wilde undergoes an experiential education understood as true Bildung. Williams, I've tried to suggest, held on to this Herderian sense of Gebildetheit, which he found wanting at Cambridge, but an organic part of Welsh cultural life. It was, simply put, the inhumanity of the Oxbridge elite that he could not stomach. They were polite, politische, and learned galante, but without civilization, they could not be properly human. Williams's Herderian understanding of humanity as Bildung, exhibits then a particular romantic ideology, McGann's famous overused term. E.P. Thompson in the 60s and then Terry Eagleton in the 70s each suggested as much. So they both critique Williams' understanding of culture as it was theorized in Culture and Society and the Long Revolution for being too romantic, too reminiscent of Wordsworth, too rooted in a particular sort of model of culture that that was at odds with sort of English left movements at the time. Say neither E.P. Thompson's nor Terry Eagleton's criticism of Williams is particularly interesting to me. I find that they both have a whiff of the very English chauvinism that Williams was pushing against. Anyways, those have both been adequately challenged in recent years. I feel a stronger resonance with the next slide. Puzzled envy, Edward Said describes comparing Williams's sense of community to his own rootless experience. Although here too, I wonder whether the opposition between the rootless and the rooted is as stark as Said suggests, and I'm going to return to that later. But do hang on to his language there, the rootless energies of people like myself. To bring us back to where we started though, it is Stuart Hall's uneasiness around Williams's romanticism that I find requires most careful attention. Where Hall opens his tribute by noting his elective affinity with Williams, that's why I had to make sure that I went back and said elective affinity again, so I need you to, right? So where Hall opens by noting his elective affinity with Williams, he ends by noting the limits of Williams' idealized vision of Wales as a model for culture. Next slide, yeah. So I know there's a lot of text there. So Hall writes, but in honoring Williams, in order to honor him, I feel compelled to close, as it were, from the place of the millions of displaced peoples and dislocated cultures and fractured communities of the South who have been moved from their settled communities, their actual lived relations, their placeable feelings, their whole ways of life. Obviously, all those terms in quotes are from Williams. They are also the products of the cultures of hybridity. These hybrids retain strong links to and identifications with the traditions and places of their origin. That is why they speak and sing and write so eloquently within the metaphorical languages of voyaging, traveling, and return. They bear the traces of particular cultures, traditions, languages, systems of beliefs, texts, and histories which have shaped them. But they are also obliged to come to terms with and to make something new of the cultures they inhabit without simply assimilating to them. Confronting with the assistance of Paul Gilroy here, Williams's emphasis of roots over routes, Gilroy's famous distinction, Hall shows that the rhetoric of settlement hypostatizes culture and constrains what Said had called the unhoused and rootless energies of people like myself. Hall, however, positions himself differently and more interestingly in relation to the unhoused and rootless. They are the products of hybridity. They bear the traces of particular cultures. I'm interested in the relationship between, on the one hand, the sense of displacement among the Oxbridge set that Hall shared with Williams, and on the other hand, Hall's rhetorical remove from the fractures communities of the South, his displacement from the displaced. Here I'm talking about the they that he keeps hitting there. This is not to suggest that Hall's hybridity is any less authentic than those of the displaced people he is identifying. The whole point of hybridity is to some extent to expose the myth of cultural authenticity. My point, rather, is that the elective affinity that Hall identified between himself and Williams may not differ in kind from the elective affinity that he felt for those hybrids of the global South. Does that make sense so far? Yeah? Huh? Next slide, please. Sorry, I guess maybe that's my presentation. I don't know. In fact, Hall identified a very troubled relationship with what he would think of as Jamaican culture, one that he related to his own racial position. Being, quote, a brown middle-class West Indian in relation to a society which was black, Hall found himself slow to commit to the third world liberation movements he would later go on to support. The strong link to and identification with places of origin that Hall associated with cultural hybrids was not, for Hall himself, always strong, and it was certainly never uncomplicated. It is Stuart Hall's brownness, I would suggest, that makes it possible for him to adjust his relationship to Jamaica and the broader fractured communities of the South, to tactically strengthen his tie to the hybrid peoples he discusses in response to Williams's organic model of culture. At the same time, it is that same brownness that prohibits complete identification with the peoples of the South. That is, his affinity with the South is complicated by his affinity with the North, and importantly, to the model of the human that emerges out of the Northern, the European Romantic tradition. I'm thinking particularly of his assessment of hybrid cultural production, how they, oh man, was it on the, can you go back to the last slide? Sorry. I'm thinking particularly of his assessment of hybrid cultural production, how they speak and write so eloquently within the metaphorical languages of voyaging, traveling, and return. So for me, I can't help but read the eloquence of the hybrid as another version of Herder's Gebildete Wilde or Williams's genuinely mannered Welshman. Another effort to mobilize the language of civility associated with the human against a particular understanding of culture. I keep looking at you to make sure I'm getting clear, so keep nodding. In other words, Hall changes the meaning of culture, but leaves the meaning of the human intact. Right? The human is still bound up with a model of civility that's coming through Romanticism. This again is a consequence of a brownness that bears the traditions, languages, systems of beliefs, texts, and histories of English Romanticism. This leads me to the question, and I'm winding down. What other understandings of the human might have emerged or might now emerge by attending to brownness? You can skip 2 slides to Munoz. There he is. To address this question, I turn to Jose Esteban Munoz's concept. I stepped away from the microphone, right? To address this question, I turn to Jose Esteban Munoz's conception of the brown commons. Munoz writes, people and things in the commons I am rendering are brown because they share an organicism that is not solely the organic of the natural as much as it is a certain brownness which is embedded in a vast and pulsating social world. Again, not organic, like a self-sufficient organism, but organic in that the world is brown as the objects within that world touch and are co-present. The brown commons is not about the production of the individual, but instead about a movement, a flow, an impulse to move beyond the singular subjectivity and the individualized subjectivities. It is about the swerve of matter, organic and otherwise, about the moment of contact and the encounter and all that it can generate. Brownness is about contact, and it is nothing like continuousness. Brownness is being with, being alongside. Now, there is, to be sure, a kind of romanticism to Munoz's vision. I think we sense it in the pace of his prose, which, like Hall's, seems to be desperately trying to capture the dynamism of brown life, the rootless energies of people on the move. But brownness, as I understand Munoz's theorization here, is not synonymous with rootlessness. The commons is a particular form of placement for the displaced. Within the commons, we need not speak of roots or even routes, but rather points of contact, generative interactions, histories whose meaningfulness lies in what they make present. Forms of comportment or civility are not measured by the extra-communal standards that undervalue brown being. Humanness is not a question of civility or incivility, but about the fact of being with and alongside. This is not for Munoz a utopian vision. There is nothing necessarily emancipatory about the brown commons. Rather, Munoz insists brownness is and has been here, whether or not we have been attuned to it. So if I understand Munoz correctly, and I may not, let me be clear, the brown commons resolves the antinomy between rooted organic culture, the Williams version, and the rootless energies of the dislocated, the Hall version, precisely by alerting us to the forms of belonging that arise in the co-presence of brown peoples and brown things. Belonging in this respect is not just about a shared history of displacement, but a shared placement in the present. What strikes me as especially provocative is in this idea is that the form of belonging need not be opposed, he's offering, need not be opposed to Williams's settled communities. Rather, we can bring the settled community into the commons, into the brown commons, and situate the lived relations of those communities in relation to the brownness already there. I'm thinking here rather literally of what it means to read Williams's community via Hazel Carby's Imperial Intimacies or Charlotte Williams' Sugar and Slate, both of which consider blackness and brownness in a Welsh context. But also, I ask, what would it mean to locate the human within the manners and customs and civilities of the Cape Verdeans who first arrived in Wales in the 17th century? Or the Yemeni and Somalian sailors who settled in Cardiff in the 19th century? Or, next slide, or to locate the human within the manners and customs of the, quote, colored nationalities whose homes were targeted and looted during the 1919 race riots across South Wales. What would it mean to look to these communities precisely as the site where the human is forged? Such a project, akin to what Foucault called a critical ontology of ourselves, is not merely a matter of expanding our archive or working to understand a brown past. It is, rather, to attune ourselves to the complex ways that the human is continually defined in the brown present. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Manu, for that wonderful first presentation. Our next panelist is Gabrielle Cornish. Gabrielle Cornish is Assistant Professor of Musicology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where her research broadly considers sound, politics, and listening cultures in Eastern Europe. In particular, her book, Socialist Noise, Sound, and Soviet Identity After Stalin, traces the intersections between music, technology, and the politics of socialist modernity under Khrushchev and Brezhnev. Her next project, Sounds for the End of the World, Cold War Epistemologies and the Sonic Imaginary, explores the relationship between acoustic technology, ecological disaster, and knowledge production in both the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. She has been supported by funding from the Fulbright Program, American Council for Learned Societies, American Musicological Society, and the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Her writing has appeared in the Journal of Musicology, the Journal of the American Musicological Society, and Slavic Review, as well as in Slate, The Washington Post, and the New York Times. Please welcome our second panelist.
Ah, beautiful. Thank you so much. Many thanks to the fellows of the Wolf Humanities Center for this very kind and honestly surprising invitation to speak to you all today. I'm also very grateful to Pamela Horn and all the other hardworking staff who coordinated our visits from behind the scenes. And thanks to all of you for coming on a Friday, and to Jacob for chairing so beautifully, or moderating so beautifully, and to my co-panelists for this exciting panel. I should preface my talk by clarifying that I am in no way a Raymond Williams expert. I'm not even sure that I understand that much about humanity these days, as the title of our session might seem to demand. But in the decades since I first encountered it as a doe-eyed PhD student, one particular Williams quote has stuck with me. In his 1977 book, Literature and Marxism, oh, it did work. It's probably not a touchscreen. In his 1977 book, Literature and Marxism, Williams conceives of the creative practice and self-creation in particular as a negotiation between two realities, one of the state, the other of the individual. It, creative practice, occurs somewhere in between ideology and biology. He writes that the creative practice can be the long and difficult remaking of an inherited or determined practical consciousness, a process often described as development, but in practice a struggle at the roots of the mind, not casting off an ideology or learning phrases about it, but confronting a hegemony in the fibers of the self and in the hard practical substance of effective and continuing relationships. Fibers of the self. Williams's human creativity is intimate, embodied, and felt from head to toe. And the body is more for Williams than just flesh, blood, and bone. It is the point in which hegemony, power, and our structures of feeling coalesce. Ideology is material. It is felt, not just believed. I think this quote captured my attention that rainy day in the grad student reading room, and continues to hold it now because it feels true. As performers, we feel before we make a sound, despite many modern conservatories' best attempts to discipline away our bodies, to instead sequester the musical object in our limbic system. And I should say now that as an academic, I can certainly relate to the desire to live in our heads and not our bodies, which I think we often treat as though they exist solely to move us from room to room. And as music historians, it's all too tempting for us to treat ideology as something that is read, written, spoken, heard, or recorded, inscribed on pages and posters and vinyl, rather than enacted on and through the body. But sound at its core is vibration, it's material, and sound, like Williams's ideology, congeals in the fibers of the self. In my talk today, I take Williams's carnal creative practice as a point of entry into one particularly beguiling moment in Soviet cultural history, the 1980s during perestroika, which for many seemed like a moment of endless possibility, somehow endlessly frozen in time. It felt, anthropologist Alexei Yurchak famously writes, like everything was forever until, as if overnight, it was no more. In seeking to understand how the collapse of the Soviet Union felt simultaneously so outrageous and yet so entirely expected, Yurchak casts the state authority as a double-edged sword. Yes, state ideology was produced and reproduced through discursive acts, but these very same discourses could be revised and reimagined by ordinary Soviet citizens. Such, he writes, was the semiotic power of discourse to produce unpredictable meanings and effects in new contexts. It was in this space between the authoritative discourse of the state and the intimacy of the individual, what Yurchak calls being vне, or this outsidedness, that the late Soviet citizen asserted his own political sovereignty. Yurchak's late socialism is one that is spoken and performed through speech acts, and his conclusions are compelling. Yet, for all its merits, I find his emphasis on language above all else ultimately unsatisfying. Yurchak's focus on what was written, spoken, and read feels surprisingly impotent, chaste, even celibate to me. Voices, Nina Eidesheim implores us to remember, do not exist outside our bodies. And flesh, as Paul Ricoeur writes, is the mediator between self and a world. And so I'm left wondering, what did the twilight of the Soviet Empire feel like in the flesh? How did it manifest in the fibers of the millions of selves who lived through it? What about the fibers of the many musicians and artists who sang, danced, strummed, banged, and otherwise sounded their way through it? And what might an embodied vně tell us about Soviet humanity that language alone cannot? Today, I explore those questions through one late Soviet art collective, the Necro-Realists, a loose ensemble of performance artists, filmmakers, and musicians formed in Leningrad in the early 1980s. The Necro-Realists probed the boundary between polite and delinquent, between human and inhuman, and between living and dead. And crucially, they did so at a time when the Soviet political body began to falter. In the span of only 3 years, as many of the country's leaders had died. Brezhnev in 1982, Andropov in 84, and Chernenko in 85. At the same time that the Necro-Realists were pulling stunts like dropping bloodied mannequins from tall buildings onto Leningrad sidewalks, the streets were filled with the bodies of dead soldiers arriving home from the war in Afghanistan. Late socialism was filled with death, decay, and destruction, and immense creativity and freedom that all cohered in the fibers of the self. Positioning the body as a site of negotiation between the individual and the state, I argue, allows us to both better understand the cultural politics of late socialism and, crucially, shift our framework from understanding Soviet agency as one focused on political sovereignty to one instead based on zoetic fungibility, a transactional model of biopolitical exchange that I argue maps onto the cultural logics of late socialism better than linguistic agency. Led by the iconoclastic director Yevgeny Yufit, the Necro-Realists experimented with disruptive displays of gore, death, undeath, and body horror. Drawing inspiration from old medical anatomy textbooks, they staged performances that shocked unsuspecting bystanders and authorities alike. Their earliest works, and here I use that term loosely, included getting naked in the snow and viciously beating one another, staging crude sexual acts in metro cars, and as I mentioned earlier, dropping mannequins complete with ersatz bloody entrails from the windows of tall public buildings. Eventually, Yufit began filming their increasingly elaborate escapades. In one, sorry, this is what happens when you try to get too cute with your PowerPoint. In one revealing anecdote from 1984, he and his friends were arrested while filming what would become their first short film, Werewolf Orderlies, for public displays of nudity and violence. The 3.5-minute film depicts a group of orderlies from a sanatorium who convulse and lurch in the woods, beat a Russian naval officer to death, set a tree on fire, climb said burning tree, and shovel snow onto each other. While holding the men in custody, the police watched this film and, much to the Necro-Realists' surprise, immediately ordered their release. The officers had deemed the footage too idiotic to reasonably prosecute. Analysis of the so-called too idiotic, of course, presents a challenge. Yurchak sees the Necro-Realists and their incoherent verbal utterances as emblematic of late Soviet irony, a sort of nihilism-tinged apophaticism. But I want to take their grotesque stunts and fleshy, messy art seriously, even if that means momentarily missing the joke. Yes, they were idiotic, but even idiots have bodies that touch, bleed, break, tickle, feel pain. Bodies that die. The necrorealists seem to have embraced death as a delinquency and an incurable deviancy, as Baudrillard put it. That these men would willingly die, even if only through ritualized performance, was perhaps their most shocking element of all. But bodies always exist in relation to other bodies. As Richard Kearney argues, a carnal hermeneutics of experience consists of both making and receiving sense. My embodied being, Kearney writes following Sartre, is inextricably linked to my being for others. Touch is sensual, immediate, erotic, even dangerous. It both creates and belongs to the world. And the body is how we know we exist, mediating, as Ricoeur says, between the intimacy of the self and the externality of the world. Yet death for much of the empire's existence was primarily the domain of the Soviet state. Socialist ideology directly correlated the health, hygiene, and physical fitness of the individual worker to the strength of the country. Those who diverged from good socialist ethics were simply unhealthy, decadent, or inhuman in some way. Under Brezhnev, for example, political dissidents were often diagnosed with psychiatric diseases and confined to mental hospitals or asylums for rehabilitation, a clinical innuendo for imprisonment. State sovereignty depended on the bodies of its citizens, cultivating a necropolitics that, as Akhil Mbembe tells us, resided to a large degree in the power and the capacity to dictate who might live and who must die. Mbembe, who's drawing on Foucault's biopolitics, focuses on sovereignty. So too does Yurchak, who suggests that in relinquishing their political voice, the necrorealists inadvertently challenged the Soviet state's monopoly on sovereignty, and in doing so, contributed greatly to creating the conditions for making the collapse of the Soviet state imminent. But there's a certain political economy to their performances that I think demands more attention. The necrorealists were not only playing with notions of sovereignty, their performances highlighted the fungibility of Soviet bodies. Writing about the economics of slave trade across the Black Atlantic, Saidiya Hartman argues that slavery relies not only on the exploitation of Black labor, but also on the disposability of Black bodies. For white Americans and Europeans, Black bodies were commodities that were replaceable and interchangeable, all in service of the large-scale accumulation of racial capital. This relation, Frank B. Wilderson III tells us, was not between the worker and the boss, but between the human and the Black. Slavery was an unrelenting and unyielding attack on Black humanity, and if Black humanity were to interrupt the logics of white capitalism, it would need to destroy this relation. Socialist fungibility follows a similar mechanism of disposability. Individual bodies were subsumed into the collective, cannibalized in the extraction of labor, and exchanged for the productive needs of the state. There are, of course, important distinctions between the socialist context and Hartman's juridical, I knew I was going to screw up that word, juridical and libidinal economies. And I certainly don't mean to equate the extortion of Soviet bodies to the violent control of Black bodies. But the parade of bodies witnessed during Perestroika was in many ways a feature, not necessarily a bug, of the Soviet project. After all, such is part and parcel of utopias, which, according to Frederick Jameson, quote, tend to measure death in generations rather than in biological individuals, end quote. Whether in the famines caused by agricultural collectivization, the hurling of bodies at the Eastern Front in World War II, or the systematized mass incarceration of the Gulag, individual mortality almost always deferred to the health of mass society. An incredible ability to metabolize death, though not unique to Soviet society, was one of its defining features. By aestheticizing this process of exchange and destruction, the necrorealists were participating in and pushing against the logics and political economy of late socialism. Take, for example, the short film Lumberjack from 1985. It's about 9 minutes long. The plot, so far as there is one, unfolds in 3 sections. In the first part, a faceless man lurches down an icy road in a forest. In the second, a mob stumbles upon the man and beats him up. And in the third, the rejoicing mob frenetically convulses in a snowy clearing. Ufit, along with the artist Oleg Kotelnikov, formed their own necro orchestra to create the soundtrack for the film. Playing cheap electric guitars, mismatched drum kits, and discarded scrap metal, a man hoarsely creaks out the lyrics to Fat Wax, a song about adipocere, which is the wax that forms in a corpse as it decays. I know all of you knew that, but I definitely had to look that up. The song's lyrics underscore the transactional logic of socialist fungibility, with dead bodies giving life to gluttonous insects. So here it says, fattened bugs devour our corpses. After death, you finally get the life you need, fellas. If anybody was looking for something to play at the club tonight. The music sounds equal parts polka, grunge, and animal shrieks as it accompanies the thrusts and falls of men committing unspeakable violence, interrupted occasionally by photos of medical cadavers, pigs hung for slaughter, and insect-infested roadkill. Maybe don't play it at the club, actually. At first glance and first listen, this song and its imagery are counter-institutional in nearly every sense, against a narrative, against harmony, and against cognition. But to see only irony is to miss the point in at least two ways. First, while discordant and clunking, Fat Wax is actually a recomposition of the very famous Soviet pop tune Our Neighbor, Nash Sosed. Written in 1965, Our Neighbor speaks to the trials and tribulations of an ordinary apartment dweller with a neighbor who has, for better and for worse, decided to learn to play the clarinet. The resident's prodigious practicing habits have replaced the woman's alarm clock, reliably waking her up on time every morning. And although the woman begins the song tongue-in-cheek, by the end she is grateful for the neighbor's quacks, becoming a normal part of her daily routine. Barely recognizable amid the din, Fat Wax inverts the domestic normalcy preached by Our Neighbor for the biological inevitability of death and decay. And I'll play a little bit of this Our Neighbor clip. It's sung here by the performer Edita Piecha, and I promise it's a bit more pleasant to listen to than Fat Wax. Oh. Can you maybe try? Yeah. Oh no, QuickTime not available. That's okay if it doesn't come through, but it was the one pleasant thing to listen to in this presentation, so. Yes, yeah. This is the ghost of Stalin getting back at me. That's okay, I can continue. No, it's all good. Okay. And second, just trust me, it does not, you would not necessarily hear Fat Wax and go, oh, that's Our Neighbor. If I weren't a percussionist, I would sing it to you, but you've already had enough torture today. And second, the music's unyielding nature ensnares us, the audience, in this project of commodity and exchange. Through sheer force of repetition, the soundtrack, which remains steady for the entire 9 minutes of the film, begins to choreograph the characters on screen. By the final scene, the movement of the actors, which has thus far been jerky and disconnected, begins to resemble a dance. While their movements are far from coordinated, the constancy of the music organizes these unwieldy bodies. It's no Swan Lake, but it might pass for Rite of Spring. Destruction, something we quietly enjoy, gives way to dancing, something we eagerly cherish. And in this way, the viewer is both drawn into and ethically implicated in the necrorealist project. We too are consuming the bodies on screen. The film might not make sense, but it is certainly sensory. And the translation of chaos into routine, into the complacency of both actors and audiences, happens without or even against our consent. And hopefully this clip works. To me, this final movement is far from comforting. It should be a peaceful resolution, a group of school children releasing doves into the air while a gentle old woman looks wistfully to the sky. But after 9 minutes of death and spectacle, I find not relief, but more horror, as I realize just exactly who I have cannibalized in my appetite for violence. Or, to return to Williams, I confront Soviet fungibility in the fibers of myself. And I fear that this is not entirely anachronistic. The political lives of bodies, dead, undead, alive, and everything in between, are still very much on display in the former Soviet empire. Putinism is meaningfully different from the Soviet system. Its focus is not on birthing a new utopia, but rather on resurrecting a deceased regime. But like it did 35 years ago, ordinary bodies are still sites in which the state and the individual collide. The capital B body becomes the place where political ideology manifests, where it seeps into the blood of the subject. But the body never exists alone. Whether we use them for pleasure or pain, a fleshy epistemology requires us to understand that bodies exist in relation to other bodies. I don't think it's insignificant, for example, that when Russian President Vladimir Putin sat in his office behind the rust-colored walls of the Kremlin in February 2022 and signed the order to invade Ukraine, he did so only a few hundred yards away from the mausoleum in which Vladimir Lenin's embalmed body rests on display, filled with formaldehyde and embalming fluid instead of blood and bile. The preservation of Lenin's corpse is its own kind of aesthetic performance, in which decomposition is forestalled through paraffin and glycerin. The bodies of both Vladimirs were at that moment intertwined in a macabre intercorporeal dance, one living, one undead, both aspiring to non-fungibility in the libidinal economy, both ready to metabolize our insatiable appetite for death. By willingly and eagerly dying, even if only on cellulose acetate and even if only for a moment, the necrorealists participated in this economy and perhaps even rebelled against its logics of accumulation. The vocabulary of fungibility persists, as do the ways it is deployed to distinguish between human and non-human, in Ukraine, in Gaza, in the United States. Perhaps to resist this transaction, we must once again look for ways to destroy that relation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Gabrielle, for a wonderful talk. Finally, we are going to hear from Stephen Weitzman. Stephen Weitzman specializes in the Hebrew Bible and the origins of Jewish culture. Recent publications include Surviving Sacrilege, Cultural Persistence in Jewish Antiquity, Religion and Self in Antiquity, The Jews, A History, and a biography of King Solomon, part of the new Jewish Lives series published by Yale University Press in 2011. Professor Weitzman received his PhD from Harvard University after completing his BA at UC Berkeley and spent several years teaching in the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University, where he served as director of its Jewish Studies program for 6 years. He comes to Penn from Stanford University, where he was Daniel E. Koshland Professor of Jewish Culture and Religion and the director of the Taub Center for Jewish Studies. Please welcome our final panelist.
I also want to thank the organizers of this wonderful session, this wonderful workshop, for the chance to be part of it. Angelina, Jeremy, the other grad students in particular. And let me take a moment to thank Jamal for serving so many years as director of the Wolf Humanities Center and undertaking the challenging experience of creating intellectual community here. So thank you, Jamal, for that. So as a scholar of religious studies, I am not going to focus on the word humanity per se, but rather on an intersecting word which Raymond Williams did not include in his glossary of keywords, and that is the word spirituality. Perhaps because Williams was coming from a Marxist orientation, he did not include in his list of keywords religion-related terms like God, faith, or religion itself. Even in the expanded list of keywords produced by Tony Bennett, Lawrence Grossberg, and Megan Morris in 2005, the only religious term that appears in that list is the word fundamentalism, which was an editorial decision which, to me at least, communicates a very deep distrust of religion as backward-looking, right-wing, and dangerous. Others have sought to rectify the religion-related omissions in Williams' glossary, but I want to focus on the word spirituality because I see a connection to the keyword humanity. For many people, as you may know, spirituality, spirit, these words refer to the most enduring, the most transcendent, the most vital, the most quintessential dimension of what it means to be a human being. But to be more specific, I'm not going to focus on the meaning of the term spirituality, but rather reflect a little bit about its ambiguity. As Williams established in so many ways, every key term has multiple and sometimes conflicting meanings, and that is no less true of the term spirituality. A recent study of how that term is used in American culture has identified 7 distinct views of spirituality that are circulating among Americans today. For some, the word has theological meaning, referring to the soul and its relationship to God, but being spiritual need not involve theistic belief, referring for others to a feeling of connection to nature. In fact, the word spiritual has long been used by some people not as a synonym for religion, but as an antonym. In one recent survey, for example, 23% of Americans identified as spiritual but not religious, as if the two terms were opposed to each other. So rather than trace the different meanings of the term, I want to focus on what people have done with the fact that spirituality means different things to different people. So since at least the 1980s, scholars have sought to clarify the role of unclarity as a medium of communication, vague, indirect, inconsistent, imprecise speech. And they've been able to show that the lack of semantic clarity, the lack of precision, equivocality, is quite useful for organizations in how they communicate within those organizations and across those organizations, allowing institutions and groups to mask internal differences and to create the appearance of consensus, allowing them to keep their options open, to deflect blame, and to protect existing privilege and power distribution. In fact, this is a point that has been made about key words themselves. Words like sustainability, actually widely circulated and yet interpreted in very different ways by business people on the one hand, by environmentalists on the other hand, and it's the vagueness of that term that allows for the appearance of uniformity and consensus. So I want to apply a similar approach to the key word spirituality and kind of explore the vagueness of that word in action. So to give some substance to my remarks, I want to put aside my Jewish studies role, which is how I'm known in these parts, and instead lean into my religious studies role and draw on a kind of side project I pursued a few years ago as a result of a chance to get to know the folks at Penn's Positive Psychology Center. For those unfamiliar with it, the Positive Psychology Center is a research center here at Penn that aims to deepen understanding of human well-being, resilience, and grit. And some of the researchers affiliated with it have an interest in religion and spiritual practice as ways to cultivate personal growth and resilience. Among the many activities of the center, it works with many different organizations, businesses, religious organizations, and one of those partnerships involved the United States Army. And the Positive Psychology Center's role in working with the Army was to help it develop a resilience program that included as one of its dimensions something called spiritual fitness training. So years of conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq had led to rising incidents of depression in the Army, post-traumatic stress disorder, domestic abuse, and suicide, increasing all of those phenomena in a precipitous way. And that led the leadership of the US Army to turn to the positive psychology and its director, Martin Seligman, to help develop and implement a program to increase the resilience of soldiers, to help them bounce back more quickly from trauma. And this program, as I mentioned, included increasing soldiers' spiritual fitness as an important goal of the program. I became intrigued by this program and how it was using the language of spirituality, and I want to use it to illustrate how the ambiguity of the key term spirituality can be organizationally useful. So the spiritual fitness program, which was introduced around 2011, had two main components. It began with a diagnostic questionnaire that was administered to all soldiers enrolling in the Army that presented them with a series of questions about their spirituality and asked them to indicate whether they agreed or disagreed with statements like, I am a spiritual person, my life has lasting meaning, or I believe there is a purpose for my life. If a person scored low on that self-diagnosis, they would receive information from the Army about optional educational modules meant to help them increase their spiritual fitness. Participation in the modules was voluntary, but there were some complaints from soldiers who felt pressured into participating. At the same time, however, some commanders and chaplains really embraced the idea of spiritual fitness and encouraged participation. And actually were quite innovative, as it were, in how they applied it. In fact, some produced spiritual fitness manuals that you can purchase on Amazon if you're so inclined to improve your own spiritual. Now, this was not the first time that the military sought to use religion to boost the morale of its troops, but it was different from earlier attempts in two ways. First was the involvement of scientific researchers in developing the program. Seligman himself, by the way, I don't know how many people have heard of him, but he's not a minor figure at Penn. In fact, he is the single most cited scholar at Penn. He's cited at least 300,000 times in scholarly literature. So Seligman himself commissioned the social scientists Kenneth Pergamin and Patrick Sweeney, who are psychologists, to help fully develop the spiritual fitness component of the program. And the Positive Psychology Center was not only involved in conceiving the idea, but helped to implement it through a training program that trained kind of non-commissioned officers to help implement the spiritual fitness dimension of the program. The involvement in academics in the effort gave a new level of scientific credibility to an effort to incorporate practices like prayer in the military culture, a project that in earlier decades was led by chaplains. And the fact that it was supported by psychologists seemed to create the appearance that it was supported by research. A second difference from the earlier attempts to incorporate religion in the Army's culture was the use of the language of spirituality as opposed to other terms like religion or faith or Christianity. So Pergamin and Sweeney introduced the concept of spiritual fitness in a special issue of the journal American Psychologist, which was published in 2011 and was introduced by no less a figure than General George Casey, the Army's chief of staff at the time. And these two psychologists spend most of their article trying to define what they mean by spirituality. They acknowledged the fuzziness of the concept, but they felt that that fuzziness needed to be unfuzzied in order to utilize spirituality as a measurable skill that could be strengthened over time in a way that physical fitness was. I won't get into this essay except to note that the ambiguity of spirituality was for these authors a kind of noise that they had to filter out in order to operationalize spirituality. And they never explored the question of why the ambiguity existed in the first place, or whether that ambiguity might be serving a function in its own right. But what I learned from my research into the spiritual fitness program that arose out of that article is that the ambiguity of the term spirituality was actually very useful to the United States Army and very important to why that language of spirituality actually took root in military culture. Like other large organizations, the US Army is full of inconsistencies and contradictions. It encompasses a wide variety of people with different belief systems. It has obligations that are in tension with one another, and its goals are sometimes directly contradictory. And part of the appeal of the key term spiritual or spirituality is that the ambiguity of these terms allow the military to negotiate these contradictions, not to solve them, but to manage them. So let me try to illustrate what I'm talking about with 3 brief examples of how the ambiguity of spirituality worked and works in military culture today. The first has to do with the ambiguous relationship between the terms spirituality and religion. The fact that spirituality can function as a synonym for religion, but can also be its antonym, as something distinct from religion and even opposed to it. Since the very beginning of warfare itself, combatants have turned to religion as a source of reassurance, hope, and emotional motivation, utilizing practices like prayer, sacrifice, and other rituals to secure divine support and protection, and to convince themselves that their cause is just. The United States military is no exception in this regard. From the time of George Washington onward, chaplains were appointed to serve the religious needs of soldiers, and commanders encouraged prayer as a way of sustaining and building courage, conviction, and morale. And that practice has continued to this day as studies of scholars' religious behavior during the Afghanistan and Iraq wars has demonstrated. As much as soldiers may rely on such religious practice, however, the Army is, of course, limited, the United States Army is limited in its ability to mobilize religious practices like prayer, because doing so comes into conflict with the Constitution's restriction on the military's ability to promote religion. Even officially organized prayer before a meal has actually been ruled unconstitutional by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. How then to manage a conflict between the long-established practice of using religion in order to boost morale in the military and the constraints on religion imposed by the Constitution? The language of spirituality offers a solution by offering the option of a kind of secularized religiosity, a mode of practice that is and is not religious at the same time. US courts have actually never resolved the question of whether spiritual practice is subject to the same restrictions that religious practices are. And therefore, a practice deemed spiritual, as opposed to religious, is currently permitted. Even when it involves prayer or Bible study, it is, if it's categorized as spiritual and not religious, it is legally acceptable. Let me just. So in other words, the language of spirituality allows the military to finesse the difference between, or the tension between constitutional limitations on religion and military practices that have long been important to military culture as a way of sustaining the courage and morale of troops. A second contradiction that the language of spirituality addresses arises from the increasing religious diversity of the Army. A 2009 survey administered by the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute to roughly 15,000 military personnel captured the situation within the military at the time that the spiritual fitness training program was introduced. Christian identity, of course, was the single largest category of religious identity, about 65%, but the second largest mode of identity was the non-religiously affiliated, which was about 25%. And the percentage of other religious traditions, Islam and other religious traditions, had also increased. So much variety had emerged over the course of the last 15 years in the United States military that in 2017, the Defense Department expanded the number of officially recognized religious identifications within the military from about 100 at that time to 221, which included religious groups like heathens and even humanists. So that growing diversity brings with it the potential for a larger number of tensions, grievances, and disputes coming from both the religious and the non-religious as each group seeks to safeguard its own rights. The grievances can come from secular organizations like the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, a kind of safeguarder of secular soldiers' rights within the Army, and which was alarmed by what it saw as the Army's pro-religious bias. But such complaints also came from religious personnel seeking accommodation of their religious practices and customs and modes of worship, such as a lawsuit that was won by a Sikh soldier that compelled the Army to allow the wearing of beards, turbans, and hijabs. So the Army is kind of in the middle of all this and has to manage all these different perspectives, addressing those angry with its alleged promotion of religion, while also striving to accommodate those who believe it is hostile to religion. So once again, the ambiguity of spirituality proves opportune, in this case, because of the way it can slide between Christian and non-Christian perspectives. The very concept of spirituality developed out of the Christian tradition and retains clear Christian connotations. But since the 19th century, it has also been used to signify non-Christian modes of religiosity, including a universalized religiosity transcending sectarian difference, an orientalized religiosity associated with Hinduism and Buddhism, and a non-theistic orientation grounded in the experience of nature, beauty, and the interconnectedness of human beings. Because of the language of spirituality can be applied to perspectives all along the spectrum of religious life, it creates an opening for people to interpret spiritual fitness in light of their particular understandings of spirituality, be that Christian, non-Christian, or non-theistic. So my third and final example of how the language of spirituality has helped the Army manage the contradictions within its culture has to do with the relationship between the military's therapeutic and military roles. The purpose of the resilience training program that Penn helped to develop was to improve soldiers' sense of well-being, to better protect soldiers from the traumatizing effects of combat so that they did not commit suicide or engage in domestic abuse or become drug addicts or end up homeless. At the same time, however, the program was also meant to augment the Army's ability to continue fighting over a long period of time by improving soldiers' ability to rotate between combat and home more frequently and to spend a longer time on the battlefield. This is the contradiction. The Army was seeking both to cultivate the well-being of its soldiers, but also to motivate those soldiers to die. So part of what makes the language of spirituality useful to the Army from this perspective is the way such language evokes both the therapeutic and the military. The word spirit in some contexts refers to the part of the self that needs to be cared for, that needs to be cultivated, nurtured, and supported. But in other contexts, the word spirit can also refer to the animating impulse that motivates a person to fight, as in the expression fighting spirit. The use of the language of spirituality therefore takes advantage of this double meaning of the word spirit, allowing the Army to finesse the contradiction between its responsibility to care for its soldiers while also motivating them to kill and be killed. The point I'm making here is that the ambiguity of spirituality as a key word is not just an accidental byproduct of its history or a result of its migration from one context to another, but serves a tactical function by allowing the military to manage conflicts to which there is no good solution. The Army lacks the legal authority and the power to impose religious uniformity on military personnel that currently work for it. There is no way to fully reconcile its commitment to the well-being of its troops with the fact that those troops need to die sometimes. These are insolvable contradictions. But for better or for worse, the key word spirituality has helped the military to manage these conflicts and contradictions, and not in spite of, but precisely because the word is so vague and hard to pin down. So I feel like I'm running out of time, so I just want to add one brief epilogue in light of recent events. The research I had been drawing on is about 4 or 5 years old. It's a little dated, and at the time, the spiritual fitness model program was growing. It was spreading from the United States Army to the Marines and was even making inroads into the Air Force as well. In each case, its adoption was an attempt to balance between two goals, serving the religious needs of the military while also being pluralistic and inclusive at the same time. Whatever one thinks of the United States military and the wars it fights, it is one of the most religiously diverse organizations in America, and its embrace of the language of spirituality was an attempt to accommodate that diversity. But what lies ahead in this, but let me ask this question. What lies ahead for this commitment to religious diversity? The new Secretary of Defense, Peter Hegseth, is known as a champion of what is known as Christian nationalism. And under that kind of leadership, it is an open question of whether the military will remain as committed to pluralism as it has in the past. It has already backtracked, of course, on gender inclusivity, and something similar might happen to its efforts to be religiously inclusive as well. A key measure in this regard, I don't know what's going to happen, obviously, but a key measure in this regard will be the fate of the language of spirituality as part of military culture, whether it becomes more Christianized in its meaning, or whether it suffers the same fate as some other key words that have recently gone asunder, the words diversity, inclusion, and equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that talk. And I'll invite our panelists to come up to the table and we'll field questions. I see one over there.
Oh, no, you went at the end, right?
Are you guys ready?
As ready
we're
as
ready.
I'll ever
Yeah.
be. Yeah.
This is a question for Gabriel. You mentioned Saidiya Hartman's work,
Mhm.
and that seems to be key for your sort of ontology. I don't know if that's the way I would put it. But I was thinking of this critique of Saidiya Hartman that Fred Moten wrote, I think, either in Stolen Life or Black and Blur. There's an article where Saidiya Hartman writes about a black prostitute, child prostitute. There's like a picture of a black child prostitute from South Philadelphia. And Saidiya Hartman talks about, like, you know, the horror in her eyes and like her exploitation, etc. And Fred Moten kind of, I mean, I don't know if I read the essay particularly well, but Fred Moten sort of criticizes her for sort of turning this into a spectacle, right? And I wonder if...
Sizes Hartman.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I wonder if your approach, which seems to me to be very positivistic, like the reality of carnality of bodies, etc., as like an undeniable, you know, thing, right? I wonder if that, in fact, obscures a certain, I don't know, it obscures the expression of, like, the expression of that violence itself, like, obscures what gives it in a certain sense. I mean, Moten would use the word talking about this subjunctive space. So something is like kind of slipping in, and the scream or the cry that would be heard in jazz comes out as like a saxophone, like, you know. So I think that, like, it just seems to me that you kind of might accidentally involve yourself in the celebration of that violence by trying to express it in such a, in this spectacular fashion.
Thank you. Were we collecting?
Yeah, let's collect some questions. Yeah, other ones. Yes.
1 second. Otherwise, people can hear you. Thank you for these papers. I was curious about, this is kind of a question for Manu and Steve's presentations. With Manu's, they're related. Where's Christianity in that figuring that you kind of draw? And the reason it kind of came to me was the discussion in religious studies about how some of the kind of concepts that we have and the language we have, starting with religion itself, right, which has gone through a whole process of self-interrogation, are actually very kind of, they have these Christological genealogies. And we know spiritualism is part of that. But I guess I'm wondering if there's a way to connect the discussions around how spirituality and the spirit is a very kind of specifically Christian concept, with the way ambiguity may or may not be functioning inclusively in the context you're looking at in the army. Like, is it actually reinscribing a kind of very Christian way by which people can experience their own traditions in measurability, or the way you were describing? And where is Christianity in this kind of older idea of the human? And does the kind of idea of brownness that you bring forward do anything to disrupt that?
All right. And then rule of threes. Third question. Yes, back there.
Thank you to all three of you. My question is for Steve. Was thinking about the way that positive psychology seems to strike me as a particularly individual enterprise, and the way that it seems to be used in the army, as you're describing, that it's about improving the spirituality of the single individual and sort of impacts different individuals separately from one another. But it also seems that one of the things that the army is trying to accomplish in the way it trains its soldiers is to subsume the individual in favor of the common good, particularly as they're fighting together for a common cause, which strikes me as something else that might be described as a spiritual effort, particularly when you then get to like a conceptualization of America as the common cause that the soldiers are fighting for. And so I'm wondering if there's a way that the use of the term spirituality and also the applications of positive psychology might be bridging that gap between the individual and the collective, or if there's other ways that you might think of the way that those are implicated.
All right. Panelists.
What order should we?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks very much for that thoughtful engagement with my work. I'm not familiar with the critique that you're referencing by Moten, so please. Thank you, yeah. From what you've described, I do think there's a key difference, and correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like the photo of the young Black girl in Philadelphia was a candid shot, not necessarily posed. She was nude and posed. Okay.
Like someone did like photographic work. I think at end was like in this library. Photos. I don't know, but one of them is this collection.
I think that. Sure. I think that raises really important questions of consent, even if it was posed, right? And of course, there's the legalistic definition of consent, which it sounds like this person who's depicted this girl as not of the age of consent, right? But I think there's this question of, is this a conscious and consensual display of that violence to be consumed? And the necrorealists are very much, that's their shtick. That's the whole ball game, right? Is that they want that violence to be consumed. And I do find that violence disturbing, and that's what I was trying to get at when I say that we too are implicated. I think there's this way in which the, to sort of take a psychoanalytical term, which is not necessarily something that I want to do, but the sort of jouissance of this, right? There's pleasure in pain. And I think that we are implicated ethically and aesthetically in this project. And that's part of what the necrorealists are trying to do. So it sounds like you and I are actually in agreement to a certain extent in that, yes, we are even inadvertently glorifying this violence by sitting down and watching it, or by discussing it at a fancy academic conference or symposium. I think the question of consent seems like a very important distinction between what you've just outlined as Moten's critique of Hartman. But I would have to read the Moten to really articulate that more clearly.
It's also the set of questions that's staged in like Clockwork Orange, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, like on the one hand, we're participating and watching, and on the other hand, it's about the act of participating and watching.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the necrorealists are similarly engaged in sort of a self-reflexive sort of turning the camera on the camera or looking at the gaze.
Yeah, and here too, I think is where the materiality of sound really congeals in the body in a meaningful way. I don't think that in that 9-minute film, Lumberjack, we would necessarily transition from viewing this as violence to viewing this as choreography without that soundtrack, right? Sound as material acts on the body, and this is one of the ways in which I think that the somatic carnal approach to late socialism can actually reveal things that a purely discursive or linguistic approach misses.
I like that.
I mean, this is like an age-old, yeah, you
Well,
would know more, but you know,
No.
Nietzsche, for example, part of his big beef with Wagner is that this is music that acts on your body without your
Yeah.
consent, right?
It's funny, actually. So the term that I use, Gebildete, is one that Nietzsche takes up in relation to Wagner, and he uses an entirely different way than Herder's using it. The question of where Christianity fits into romantic understandings of the human, it's sort of, let me speak in broadest terms, probably still the dominant way of approaching that question is via Murray Abrams' natural supernaturalism. So the argument in short is that faced with the increased secularization that comes out of Enlightenment rationalism, that the Romantics essentially offer an alternative version of the supernatural that is not grounded in religion. And that actually there, the term that, you know, you would probably find, or that you would, is in fact spirituality, right? Spirituality enters sort of through the Romantics, sort of skepticism towards traditional religious sort of institutions, but their efforts to think through connective tissues that sort of, that celebrate intersubjective relations. And I do think, the last thing I'll say before I turn it over, I do think that one of the things that happens, I mean, I was thinking about this as I was listening to you talk, I was like, yeah, when you read Munoz on the Brown Commons, there really is a sense of spirituality there. He would never use that word because he's really coming out of that sort of Marxist humanist tradition, but he turns to the language of affect, right? And shared affect and shared sensibility. And he gets that through a sort of another secular, I mean, he says that he never got into Deleuze, but it's all very Deleuzian, you know, as another way of secularly theorizing the things that happen when we assemble disparate people and things. Does that get it? Yeah.
And I'm not sure I'm going to get at your question, but spiritual fitness, this idea, you know, one of the kind of most famous critiques of it is that it is a product of neoliberalism and a product of kind of globalization in an American sense. It's a deracialized notion. But what's interesting about it is, you know, I want to make a distinction between what keywords mean and what they do. And if you look at what this keyword did or what it does, it motivated Christians. It didn't motivate other religious groups. It motivated Christians to come up with pilgrimages and prayer sessions and Bible study sessions. You know, there was one soldier who founded a Buddhist meditation center in Afghanistan, but that's the only example of somebody from a Buddhist tradition or identify with Buddhism taking advantage of it. So to me, that communicates its intimacy with Christianity, the fact that it resonated, especially for Christians. And then, Jeremy, to address your question briefly, I think that's what the Positive Psychology Center was trying to do with spirituality. It can refer to the spirit of a group, fighting spirit of a group. It can refer therapeutically to the kind of spiritual state of an individual. And I think that's another example of how it's trying to finesse contradictory goals. But in the end, because it was a product of neoliberalism, basically what it was doing was taking the very dire problem of suicide and homelessness and drug addiction and imposing responsibility to address those on the individual soldier and saying, this is because you're not spiritually fit enough and you need to do something about that.
Wonderful. We have time for just one more question. Let's go over there, please. Sorry, Penise, you can come talk later.
Thank you all so much for this. I'm curious, wanted to hear a little bit of a connection perhaps between this panel and the previous panel around imperialism, specifically because there is such a through line of not just war, but as was mentioned before, kind of, the intimacies that happen and the kind of torn nature, as Anna had mentioned, of war afterwards. And so I would love to hear some of the ways that you all see imperialism and war in a permanent nature kind of shaping some of the senses that you are grappling with in humanity. And I mean, I'm really taken by also this concept of spiritual fitness, because I'm thinking about the relationship between the presentation on, when I think of spiritual fitness, I also think of like militaries, training to do yoga after, engaging in warfare, right? And there's a specific political economy, right, between the relationship between, for instance, the Indian state and the Israeli military, or the American military's relationships with these circulations of yoga, right? And so I just would love to hear a little bit more about how you understand the concepts of imperialism really fundamentally shaping what it means to be human right now, with the torn pieces that we have of the human today.
Yeah, it's good. There's sort of a lot of questions in there, and there's several ways to sort of take it up. I think that the thing I was thinking about in the last panel, there was a question about at the very end, the idea of the relationship between nations and the nation state and and imperialism. And I was thinking about that. What makes one empire like the other? And I think it's the question. Part of it, at least, is the question of imperialism produces minoritized subjects and minoritized affect. It's not that they're not there in the nation state, right? But the myth of the nation is that of a coherent people, right? Imperialism is where minoritarian questions of minority identity sort of come up that then pressure ideas about the human. I just want to say this really quick. The spiritual fitness thing reminds me, like, did you guys have to do the presidential physical fitness test when you were kids? My daughter, like, they have to like run and stuff, and she hates it. She's 9. And so she was like telling her teacher, gym teacher, like, I'm not going to do it. And the gym teacher was like, she has to do it. And I was like, you know why they had the presidential physical fitness test is because we were in the Cold War. They're essentially producing us to be soldiers. And well, the gym teacher didn't appreciate it. That I was siding with my daughter. The idea that, name the thing that a military industrial complex will not capture in order to mobilize. Name it. I can't think of it. Multiculturalism, spiritual, right? And it's not just a military industrial complex, every imperial formation, right? And in fact, last night we were talking about this new book by Arjun Shankar on brown saviorism, the way that brownness has now been used in a very un-Munoz sort of liberatory way to essentially put a face on sort of white saviorism, right? And like it's that is the move. That's the really fascinating thing about studying keywords is like, I can't think of one that's not open to capture, right? I can't think of how imperialism isn't open to capture, how we can't say, well, we're fighting the other empire, the Chinese empire now, right?
We've captured it today.
Yeah. That's exactly, yeah. I don't know if I spun off away from it, and I do want to give you guys time. So I'm sorry, I'm a talker.
Your question is circling around things I'm thinking a lot about these days, but I will just say that I'm a scholar of antiquity. So on that basis, I would make a case that the category of humanity is itself a product of imperialism. Like, when did people first need a category of identity that was universal, that transcended ethnic and religious identity, and why did they use that category? And it was the Roman Empire, and it was to justify its rule of a multicultural, So I think the category of humanity is thoroughly implicated in imperialism, and what we need to do, I think, is think a little bit more deeply about what it means to be implicated.
Yeah, I think what I see at play in the 1980s that I'm looking at with this talk and today in, say, the war in Ukraine. We're coming up on the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale invasion in just a day or two. Is this logic of extractivism. And, you know, scholars of the Black Atlantic talk about this in relation to the transatlantic slave trade. But I think, too, there's this means, again, this is always coming back to the sort of global military-industrial complex, which even in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was integrated economically to a certain extent, much less than you would see, you know, in Western Europe, with these global military industries. One of the anecdotes I always tell my students is that for like a hot minute in, I want to say 1988, Pepsi was the like 7th largest navy in the world. Wow. Because the Soviet Union didn't have the hard currency to pay for its import of Pepsi. And so they just gave Pepsi a bunch of scrapped submarines to then sell for scrap metal. I think this is 87 or 88.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a great opening line on first dates. But I think we can look at what Putin is doing. You liked that one. We're gonna end on a cheerful note in the midst of death and
This
imperialism.
folksy Western New York.
Yeah,
we're both
you know,
like
we're gonna
Bills
have
fans.
wings afterwards. This is all to say, I think that the logics of extraction are very much at play in, say, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, although, of course, this is also a sort of deterrence in colonial project in capturing the non-aligned world, but it's very much about oil as well. I think that Putin's invasion of full-scale invasion, but even starting back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, is about the extraction of labor, but also natural resources. Yeah. And we see this with the way that Trump is allegedly trying to negotiate with Ukrainian President Zelensky about mineral rights in Ukraine, and that being a major condition of basically whether the US will invite Ukraine to the table. So I think that's kind of an underscoring connection.
Yeah.
All right. Let's give a round of applause for our wonderful panelists.
Thank you, guys.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today after this long day of incredibly enriching and thought-provoking talks. Thank you very much to Jeremy. Thank you to all of the organizers of this conference for the invitation to be here today. So I'm an art historian of the ancient Middle East and the ancient Mediterranean. How do I get this to go? I know we've all had this problem. I'd point it here. Ah, there we go. Thank you. This one's fine. Even more specifically, I study miniature artworks produced during the Hellenistic period after the conquest of Alexander the Great in Babylonia, southern part of modern Iraq. These miniature artworks are common, pervasive even. Tens of thousands of terracotta figurines have been excavated from Hellenistic Babylonian sites. From a single city, Seleucia on the Tigris, 30,000 seal impressions, marks in clay made by one's personal seal in order to authenticate a document, have been recovered. Despite their high value, hundreds of silver and bronze coins adorned with miniature imagery survive in the archaeological record. This was a social world populated with tiny humans, tiny gods, and tiny animals. I argue that studying these artworks is crucial to understanding this society, its people, culture, and values. Because my work focuses so strongly on the social and cultural effects of art objects in the ancient past, I must admit that I almost never use the keyword aesthetics under which my talk today is positioned. As Williams describes, aesthetics has become bound up with subjectivity, exclusivity, rare beauty, and the cultivation of taste, particularly in art. For my students today, the keyword can apply to personal style, such as in dress or in home decor. It is roughly synonymous with one's vibe, but one's aesthetic can be curated, and use of the word implies good taste, discretion, and judgment. But for my work, it is irrelevant whether anyone today considers these ancient miniatures to be beautiful. I do, but you don't have to. Furthermore, as Williams so astutely notes, isolating the subjectively beautiful qualities of art from their social and cultural interpretations is limiting, even damaging, for it risks marginalizing the visual from the practical. But visually appealing objects in the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East were made to be both beautiful and practical. Indeed, these qualities were often linked. Statuettes, jewelry, and coins were capable of commanding the attention of humans and gods alike precisely because they were visually appealing. Yet in Williams's work, I have found a productive way into the word aesthetic. In focusing on how art stimulates the senses directly, I am following Williams in returning to aesthetics in its original form, as an essentially new word invented in the 19th century, but derived from the ancient Greek aesthesis, sense perception. And so I begin with how miniature objects stimulate the senses. Building off the path-breaking work of Susan Stewart in her 1984 book On Longing, Narratives of the Miniature, the Gigantic, the Souvenir, and the Collection, scholars working with miniaturization theory have developed an understanding of small-scale works as having particular effects on the human body and human experience. These objects inspire fascination and amazement, enticing their users into bodily, sensual engagement. Viewers of the miniature have the sense of being drawn into another world. An invitation to tactile interaction is a critical component of this dialogue, as it encourages the user's hand to bridge the otherwise disorienting scalar difference between figurine scale and real-life size, smoothing the user's imagined entry into and participation within the miniaturized landscape. The critical role of tactile interaction and bodily intimacy explains why many three-dimensional miniatures conform easily in size, shape, texture, and durability to the human hand's ability to touch and grasp. Through these accommodations to the user's body, miniatures inspire a kind of enchantment, following Alfred Gell's use of the word, with the idea that a small-scale world could be so easily accessible. When coupled with the obvious physical dominance of the user, this open receptiveness of miniatures seduces users with the opportunity to feel enlarged and empowered. Regardless of his or her status in society, the user can rule and control what Bachelard referred to as the daydream of a life within a life. Like this small Ukrainian boy displaced by war, playing on a hotel room bed with tanks and soldiers, controlling for himself miniature versions of the forces that control his life in this moment. This alluring combination of wonderment and accessibility, even intimacy, is crucial to both the aesthetic appeal and the social function of miniatures. Yet, in the ancient languages of Greek and Akkadian, there is no word for miniature, as we understand it in English, as a small-scale representation of a larger object or being. The word miniature in English derives from minium, the Latin word for red lead. Minium was the crucial ingredient in red pigment used by medieval monks and scholars when painting small-scale pictures in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. It was thus that the pigment became associated with reduced-scale artworks in later eras. Yet in Akkadian and Greek, there are words for small and tiny, but not the particular aspect of being scaled down. Similarly, there is no word for art in either Greek or Akkadian as a catch-all term for objects of aesthetic value. Instead, there exist narrower, more specific words for image, statue, figurine, seal, such as the Akkadian word salmu for image or likeness, or words for broader concepts like the Sumerian word me, which when used in the plural indicates knowledge of the entirety of the arts, technologies, and the wisdom of civilization. But even though there is no Greek or Akkadian translation for, quote, small-scale visual artworks, unquote, nevertheless, small-scale visual artworks were deeply important to the people who spoke and read Greek and Akkadian. As a scholar, I am labeling from my positionality, giving keywords to a group of objects, calling them miniatures, calling them art, where there were none originally, or weren't there. I raise the question here of whether it is accurate or honest or respectful to discuss a society and its cultural heritage in foreign edict terms. In many cases, I would say we need to be quite careful, but I also want to make a case for finding our keywords not just in language alone. Objects are also agentive and communicative. Objects, including visually appealing objects, can suggest the critical importance of concepts and ideas to a group of people who may not express those concepts in words, but are still expressing them in visual or other aesthetic form. Just because your language does not have a word for something doesn't mean that you don't see it or feel it or even find it tremendously important, find it to be key in the sense of being crucial. Art is not just a keyword, it can be a tool for finding keywords that might happen to not be words in the linguistic sense. Using non-linguistic evidence, such as art, to deduce key social concepts is especially important in a multicultural environment where people were coming together who might not necessarily have spoken the same language. This is the value of using the keyword miniature, bringing together objects that are small scale so we can study and understand how their scale impacts the people who use them. But what about miniatures that don't fit our usual definition in English? Indeed, Claude Lévi-Strauss suggested that all art is in some way miniature. Objects that include small-scale imagery, such as the seals and intaglios of the ancient Mediterranean, are sometimes analyzed as miniatures, but coins, which are similar in terms of size and thus the use of small-scale imagery, and often the subject matter of that imagery, are usually not considered miniatures per se. The painted small-scale portrait miniatures of early modern Europe have been the subject of several studies, but the photographs that have replaced them, and yes, I did use my own family as a stand-in here, have not often been analyzed as miniatures, and yet they are. Look at your phone. Miniatures abound. Textile designs, especially embroidery work and ceramic decoration, such as Greek quote-unquote vase painting, is often abundant with small-scale imagery that is rarely studied as such. Inca monumental architecture, there we go, much larger than human beings, was nevertheless often designed to be a miniature version of the mountain peaks that towered above. Once we start to look, miniatures are everywhere. Would the common understanding of the keyword need to stretch to accommodate all of these objects? Yes, a little. But as an art historian, I see advantages to utilizing miniaturization theory as an interpretive lens as widely as possible. If it helps us understand the art, both people's sensory experience of it and its social function, then the keyword can still be useful. Now, from this discussion of miniaturization, I move now to my next keyword, hybridity. Unlike miniature, hybridity is a word with ancient origins. It is probably derived from the ancient Greek word hubris, a word which itself has a wide range of meanings, from arrogance to overstepping boundaries to violence, particularly related to offending the gods. The term is more concretely attested in Latin, where the term hybrida referred to the interbreeding of animals from different species or varieties. The biological associations of the word hybridity were revived by Charles Darwin and other Enlightenment-era scientists. It has hence been used to describe the mixture or crossbreeding of plants and animals to create new varietals or even species, labradoodles and fancy prize-winning roses. More destructively in some cases, the term hybrid has also been applied to human beings, particularly when speaking in racial terms. The path-breaking work of Homi Bhabha in the 1990s jump-started the widespread scholarly use of the term to describe cultural and aesthetic mixture, particularly in events of colonization and colonialism. The term has been a point of contention since then, with many scholars, including myself, both using and criticizing it simultaneously. The advantage of the term hybridity is that it provides a label, and thus a way of speaking about, art objects that appear to be a blend of multiple cultural traditions, such as the use of Roman-style naturalistic portraiture and Egyptian-style mummification and coffins. But among the many valid critiques of hybridity are that it implies uniformity across all aspects of cross-cultural encounter, and that it essentializes cultural groups into isolated and bounded entities that are imagined to interact in a simplistic recipe-like fashion, as if Greeks and Babylonians could be added to a bowl and then stirred. Yet the evidence from the ancient objects suggests that the process of cultural blending is far more complex, with a greater diversity of outcomes than an additive equation would suggest. Now, in my work, I have countered some of these difficulties with the word hybridity by focusing on the human agency behind every instance of cross-cultural exchange, finding the people and recognizing their active participation in the process. And in fields of study much more recent, this may seem very obvious, but in the ancient world, when we're often dealing only with the objects left behind, it is sometimes hard to remember the people behind them. In my own work, I use the term hybridity with a purpose in order to center that human agency and recognize that people who are engaged with multiple cultural forms are always making selective choices. Creating a hybrid aesthetic is never a straightforward process of interbreeding cultures. People negotiate. They choose what to use, what to keep, and what to leave behind, what is compatible for blending and how much it should be intertwined. If we investigate those choices, there is always much meaning and much humanity behind them. In other words, I probe beyond the what of a hybrid artwork to get to the how and the why. For example, in Hellenistic Babylonia, figurines of nude men were very uncommon, very rare. This is unusual given that the nude male is a common theme in Greek sculpture. The one exception to this is figurines of the Greek god Heracles, which are actually more popular in Hellenistic Babylonia and the Middle East more generally than they are anywhere else in the entire Hellenistic world. Now, why? Figurines of Heracles in Hellenistic Babylonia are quite varied in pose and style, with some figures conforming more to the canon of Greek art, and particularly to the languid contrapposto seen in the famous Weary Heracles by the sculptor Lysippos. Other figurines, such as the example in the middle of this slide with its open-work legs, are posed more frontally, powerful but rigid, in a more Mesopotamian style. Why this cultural exchange over a nude Greek male god, and yet a near unwillingness to even depict non-divine nude males? In my previous work, I've argued that this is evidence of social negotiation. Babylonian culture had a long-standing aversion to depicting the nude male body, which was shown usually only in situations of military defeat, punishment, and degradation. The one exception to this was the ancient Mesopotamian god, known only to us by his description that we call him the nude-belted hero, whose main attribute was his prowess at wrestling and hunting lions. Heracles, as a lion-hunting hero god, made sense in Babylonia in a way that beautiful Greek nude male athletes did not. Visual hybridity in Heracles' figurines thus served as a social binder, emphasizing a point of connection between cultures, while the choice to ignore and discard other nude male imagery was a way to downplay differences and potential points of friction between Greeks and Mesopotamians. In other words, in examining the choices made in creating hybridity, we can begin to glimpse its purpose. The term hybridity is often entangled with discussions of colonial encounter, although hybrid art can obviously be created under other social circumstances. But it is with colonization in mind that I move to my third and final keyword for today, post-colonialism, which chimes, of course, with many of the other excellent talks we've heard today. But I have included an asterisk after the term post-colonialism to say in the study of antiquity, for my discussion here is centered on how the term post-colonialism can and should mean something very different for the study of the ancient art and ancient societies than it does in a post-1492 context. Of course, as we all know, the term post-colonial was developed in the 20th century to talk about cultures and societies that had formerly been colonized, particularly by European nation states, and now had exited the period of formal political control, but vestiges and after effects of that colonization remained. In physical terms, monuments, urban planning, nation-state borders, as well as social, cultural, and linguistic effects. In many ways, the study of the post-colonial is a very modern pursuit. So how is this useful for the study of archaeology and ancient art? Well, taking a post-colonial view of the past means decolonizing our scholarship. This has two values. First, it extracts the study of ancient empires and colonial encounters from a cycle of modern comparison. And here I'm building on the work of many great scholars who have also worked in this vein, archaeologists Solange Ashby, Chris Gosden, Greg Wolf, and many others. So in his path-breaking study of Orientalism, Edward Said repeatedly discussed how 18th and 19th century European imperial powers, such as Britain and France, used the example of ancient colonizers and empires, particularly the Hellenistic kingdoms after Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire, as a role model. Yet in actuality, the Hellenistic kingdoms after Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire were vastly different. from French, German, Belgian, British colonialism in many ways. While ancient Rome was undoubtedly formidable, the stark differential in military power and technology seen in post-1492 colonization events did not exist in the ancient Mediterranean. Despite what Hollywood would lead us to believe, Rome met its match and was repelled many times by Parthia in the Middle East, a trivial negotiation with which was celebrated as a major victory in this crucial statue of Augustus. They were defeated by the kingdom of Meroe in the Sudan, who infamously took a statue of Emperor Augustus and buried it under the steps of their temple to victory so that his face would be repeatedly symbolically stepped on. Certainly, there were not the same tragedies of the spread of disease to immunologically naive populations that we get with the colonization of what is now called North and South America. And most importantly, for art, ancient colonization almost never brought together two cultures that had no prior contact. Centuries before the Roman Empire ever existed, the Etruscans in Italy had been trading with the Phoenicians and with the Greeks, trading, in fact, all over the Mediterranean through the Phoenicians and the Greeks. These societies knew each other, and they knew each other well, long before colonization occurred. And so we need to understand the art they produced in response to colonization on very different terms. But it can be hard to recognize all of these facts and interpret all this archaeological and art historical evidence in its own particular context if we as scholars are trapped in the colonial mindset of assuming ancient empires like Rome were nearly identical to the British Empire. In many ways, we've still bought the British Empire's propaganda. Post-colonial scholarship in the study of antiquity means working to decolonize our interpretations and analysis, working to understand these cultures, societies, empires, and the art they made to express their identities, valorize their conquests, negotiate with the other people they encountered on their own terms, not refracted through the distorting lens of 18th and 19th century comparisons. Now, in addition to this scholarly benefit, severing the perceived link between recent empires and ancient ones benefits a post-colonial world today, and in particular, the people living in post-colonial societies. A link to the dignity of the past, the greatness of Alexander, the grandeur that was Rome, was used as a justification by European and American politicians, generals, and rulers to rationalize the colonizing process as a noble and natural one. It gave historical precedent. But what if we consider that the massive colonization events perpetrated by Europeans in the period from 1492 to the early 20th century were a human aberration rather than a human norm? What if history no longer provided an excuse for recent atrocities? And so I conclude my talk in the spirit of Raymond Williams, using the words of Colin McCabe from his foreword to the 2014 edition of Keywords. Quote, "How lengthy are the processes by which we create meanings," unquote. This is whether by expanding the definition of the miniature, reshaping hybridity as agentive, or reorienting the historical remit of postcolonialism. In addition to encouraging this longue durée process of meaning making, I also advocate using artworks themselves to generate keywords. It is by studying their visual and material details closely, allowing them to stimulate our senses as in the original meaning of aesthetic, that these ancient objects of visual interest can lead us into an understanding of what terms, concepts, and ideas should focus and define our analysis. Thank you.